the course of our everyday lives, we constantly are making judgments and decisions. One of the most important decisions you may have made is that of whether and where to go to college. Once in college, you still need to decide on which courses to take. Later on, you may need to choose a major field of study. You make decisions about friends, dates, how to relate to your parents, how to spend money, and countless other things. So how do you go about making these decisions? Hi, I'm Krizza, and I'm your first reporter for Chapter 12. Now we will discuss about the judgment and decision making, heuristic, and biases. Now let's start. Under the judgment and decision making is the classical decision theory. The earliest models of how people make decisions are referred to as a classical decision theory. Most of these models were devised by economists, statisticians, and philosophers, and not by psychologists. Hence, they reflect the strength of the economic perspective. One such strength is the ease of developing and using mathematical models of human behavior. Next is the model of economic men and women. Among the early models of decision-making crafted in the 20th century was that of economic men and women. This model assumed three things. First is the decision makers are fully informed regarding all the possible options for their decision and all the possible outcomes of their decision options. Second is that they are infinitely sensitive to the subtle decisions among decision options. They are fully rational in regards to their choices of options. The assumption of infinite sensitivity means that people can evaluate the difference between two outcomes, no matter how subtle the distinctions among options may be. The assumption of rationality means that people make choices to maximize something of value, whatever that something may be. Here's an example of how this model works. So, suppose that the decision maker is considering which of the two smartphones to buy. The decision maker, according to this model, will consider every aspect of each phone. So first, he or she will rate each possible choices, then weighted the choice, then use your favorability ratings and ways to compute an average evaluation of each of the choices. The shopper then will buy the smartphone with the best score. The next theory is the subjective expected utility theory. It is an alternative model makes greater allowance for the psychological makeup of each individual decision maker. The goal of human action is to seek pleasure and avoid pain. So in making decisions, people usually seek to maximize pleasure and to minimize the pain. In doing so, however, each of us uses calculations of two things. The subjective utility is a calculation based on the individual's judged weightings of utility, rather than on objective criteria. An example of this in the business world might be when a manager implements a new business plan and it meets with their personal, individual definition of success rather than the definition of success in their field. Next is the subjective probability, which is a calculation based on the individual's estimates of likelihood rather than on objective statistical computation. So when have you seriously considered every aspect of a decision, rated each possible choice, weighted the choice, and then used your favorability ratings and weights to compute an average evaluation of each of the choices? Probably not recently. The world is full of information and stimuli of different kinds. In order to function properly and not get overwhelmed, we need to filter out the information we need among the many different pieces of information available to us. The same holds time for decision making. In order to be able to make a decision within a reasonable time frame, we need to reduce the available information to a manageable amount. Heuristics help us to achieve this goal and at the same time decrease our efforts by allowing us to examine fewer cues or deal with fewer pieces of information. So let's explore heuristic first. Heuristics are mental shortcuts that lighten the cognitive load of making decisions. However, sometimes our thinking also gets biased by our tendencies to make decisions more simply. The mental shortcuts of heuristics and biases lighten the cognitive load of making decisions, but they are also allow for a much greater chance of error. One of the first heuristics that was formulated by researchers is termed satisficing. So satisficing is considered option one by one, and then we select an option as soon as we find one that is satisfactory or just good enough to meet our minimum level of acceptability. So basically, we have to choose an item that is good enough than being perfect. That is satisficing. So satisficing is only one of the several strategies people can use. The appropriateness of this strategy will vary with the circumstance. For example, satisficing might be a reasonable strategy if you are in a hurry to buy a pack of gum and then catch a train or a plane. Next is the elimination by aspects. It is when we eliminate alternatives by focusing on the aspects of each alternative one at a time. We sometimes use a different strategy when faced with far more alternatives than we feel that we reasonably can consider in the time we have available. If you are trying to decide which college to attend, the process of elimination by aspect might look like this. First, focus on one aspect of the various options. For example, the cost of going to college. Next, form a minimum criterion for that aspect. For example, the tuition must be under 20,000 per year. Next, eliminate all the options that do not meet that criterion. For example, the Stanford University is more than 30,000, so the Stanford University will be eliminated. Next is for the remaining options, select a second aspect for which we set a minimum criterion by which to eliminate additional options. The college must be on the West Coast because it is probably near your house. And continue using a sequential process of elimination of options by considering a series of aspects until a single option remains. According to Herbert Simon, people often satisfies when they make important decisions, such as which car to buy. In choosing a car to buy, we may focus on the total price as an aspect. We may choose to dismiss factors such as maintenance cost, insurance cost, or other factors that realistically might affect the money we will have to spend on the car in addition to the sale price. We often use mental shortcuts and even biases that limit and sometimes distort our ability to make rational decisions. One of the key ways in which we use mental shortcuts centers on our estimations of probability. Consider some of the strategies used by statisticians when calculating probability. So the table below is an example on how to calculate probability. For instance, you might want to calculate the likelihood of receiving an A for a cognitive psychology course given that you receive an A on the final exam. The formula for calculating conditional probabilities in light of evidence is known as Bayes' theorem. It is quite complex, so most people do not use it in an everyday reasoning situations. Nonetheless, such calculations are essential to evaluating scientific hypotheses, formulating realistic medical diagnosis, analyzing demographic data, and performing many other real-world tasks. If you were to meet an attractive woman, slim, and enjoy stunning, what do you think would her profession would be? A teacher or a model? What do you think? Kahneman and Tversky explains the tendency of people to judge probabilities or likelihoods according to how much more one thing resembles another. Example: Kate is attractive, slim, and Joyce stunning. When people were asked whether she was a teacher model, people picked model because she meets the prototype. The availability heuristic is defined as a mental shortcut for making frequency or probability judgments based on the ease with which instances or occurrence can be brought to mind. For example, the participants were asked if more words in English language start with letter K or have third letter K. In this case, our memories of words that begin with K comes to mind more readily than do memories of words with the third letter K. Next is anchoring and adjustment heuristic. It describes how and when estimating certain value, we tend to give an initial value then adjust it by increasing or decreasing our estimation. However, we often get stuck that initial value which is referred to as anchoring. For example, when the price of a TV set is given as 3,000, people adjust their estimate of its production cost more than when the price is given as 2,991. Anchoring effects occur in a variety of settings. For example, an art auction where the price of painting is anchored by the price the painting achieved in the prior sales, or monthly economic forecast, which are anchored towards the past month. Next in heuristic is framing, or the framing effect. It is a cognitive bias where people decide on options based on whether the options are presented with positive or negative connotation. People tend to avoid risk when positive frame is presented but seek risk when the negative frame is presented. For example, as a lose or as a gain. Next is biases. Under biases is the illusory correlation, overconfidence, and hindsight bias. We are predisposed to see particular events or attributes and categories as going together, even when they do not. This phenomenon is called illusory correlation. For example, they suggested that people diagnosed with paranoia tend to draw people with large eyes more than do people with other diagnoses, which is not true. So what happened when individual expected to observe a correlation between a drawing with large eyes and the associated diagnosis of paranoia? They tended to see the illusionary correlation, although no actual correlation exists. Next is the overconfidence bias. It is a tendency to hold a false and misleading assessment of our skills, intellect, or talent. In short, it is an egotistical belief that we're better than we actually are. For example, when people were 100% confident in their answers, they were right only 80% of the time. In general, people tend to overestimate the accuracy of their judgments. People sometimes make poor decisions as a result of overconfidence. These decisions are based on inadequate information and ineffective decision-making strategies. So why we tend to be overconfident in our judgment is not clear. So why are people overconfident? One reason is that people may not realize how little they know. Another reason is that they may not realize that their information comes from unreliable sources. Lastly, we will talk about the hindsight bias. It is a bias that can affect all of us, is what we call hindsight bias. When we look at a situation retrospectively, we believe we easily can see all the signs and events leading up to a particular outcome. So for an example, when an intimate personal relationship are in trouble, people often fail to observe signs of the difficulties until the problem reach crisis proportions. By then, it may be too late to save the relationship. Hindsight bias hinders learning because it impairs one's ability to compare one's expectations with the outcome. If one always expected the outcome that eventually happened, One thinks there is nothing to learn. And indeed, study shows that the investment banker's performance suffers when they exhibit a strong hindsight bias.